You consider yourself an individual, but are you in fact built of rivaling neural networks? Can we see ourselves as a collection of personalities? How do we manage the conflict between different drives in our brains? And what does this have to do with deities or literature or maturation? And what did Friedrich Nietzsche mean when he said that every drive we have wants to, quote, represent just itself as the ultimate purpose of existence and the legitimate master of all the other drives? Or as he also put it, quote, every drive wants to be master and it attempts to philosophize in that spirit. What exactly does that mean? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and author at Stanford, and in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to uncover some of the most surprising aspects of our lives. Today's episode is about how we are built of complex circuitry. Each of us is not like a simple computer program, but instead a machine built on conflict. This is a topic I have loved and written about for many years. And in today's podcast, I talk with a colleague who equally loves this topic from the point of view of clinical psychology. Today, we talk with Jordan Peterson. He's one of our most well-known psychologists. He was formerly at Harvard University and the University of Toronto, and has now started his own educational platform called the Peterson Academy. You likely know Jordan from his books, which have found wide audiences like 12 Rules for Life, and his newest book, We Who Wrestle with God. Jordan and I are going to visit some key points in our conversation. The first is that as we age, we find ways to make these networks in our brain work together better. And this is, in a sense, the definition of maturation. We'll also talk about the spectrum from a basic drive like reproduction to something richer that we might call a personality. We'll come to the role of setting contracts with yourself to wrangle the behavior of the networks. And finally, we're going to discuss the role of literature and religion in setting up a way to direct the conflicting networks by giving them an external exemplar to look to. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jordan Peterson. So Jordan, I'm very interested in how we are a collection of different things going on the inside. We use the term individual when we talk about ourselves, but in fact, we're made up of many different drives or personalities or neural networks. This is what we'll get into. So in my book Incognito, I talked about it as a team of rivals. I know you think about things as a collection of personalities. I'd like us to get into that. So how do you think about what we're made of, who we are?
I like the metaphor of personality. Might be deeper than a metaphor. It might just be a description because it works on a variety of different levels. It adds sophistication to the idea of drive because a drive has an algorithmic and mechanical connotation to it. But a personality has perceptions and emotions, and it has ideas, and it has opinions. And our internal motivational states are like that. So, like the desire for sexual gratification brings with it a perceptual framework, obviously. Same with anger, the same with hunger.
And perceptual framework means what we notice, how we act.
How we prioritize our attention and how we sequence our actions. Yeah. But then there's a deeper level too, which I think you'll find interesting. So I spent a lot of time studying the work of a historian of religions named Mircea Eliade. And Eliade described a pattern he saw across cultures, which was probably the psychological record of integration of tribes across time. So imagine every tribe has a value structure. It's usually represented by a superordinate deity or a set of deities. Okay, now, and one tribe meets another and they start to interact. Well, that often involves war, and it certainly involves discussion. It involves cooperation and competition. But there's a cognitive element to that too. So as the cultures integrate, the ideas integrate. Well, that's represented in the mythological literature as a battle between gods in heaven. Right, and one of Eliada's points was that the battle between these gods, so these are personalities, tends towards a monotheism across time. As multiple cultures integrate, they integrate towards a monotheism. You might say, well, what's the evidence for that? It's like, well, mono implies unity, integration implies unity. If cultures interpenetrate and there's no unity, they're not integrated. They might occupy the same territory, but they're not integrated.
Interesting.
And I think there's a parallel between that war of personalities that's represented, let's say, in the mythological literature, and the integration of fundamental motivational states in the process of maturation within a culture. I think those are the same thing. And if that's the case, then, well, you see a unification of phenomena across a very wide range of inquiries.
Let's talk about what we mean by integration, because in fact, what we have is a battling of these networks all the time, certainly when you're a child, but even as you grow older and you set the path for your life and so on, you're always battling with yourself, as in, oh, I should eat the cake, I shouldn't eat the cake, I should go do this thing, I shouldn't do this thing. And so you can cuss at yourself, you can cajole yourself, you can contract with yourself, you can get angry at yourself.
Yep.
And the question is, who is getting angry at whom?
That's for sure.
Right. So in a sense, we're still like the polytheism on the inside.
Definitely.
We never quite made it to a monotheism.
Okay. So I'd like to address that while simultaneously addressing something that you said at the beginning of this discussion. So you talked about us as individuals who are at war with our internal states, let's say, or we're a battleground of warring internal states. And so we're made out of parts and we coalesce at the individual level. But I would say that's not sufficient. That's a necessary description, but it's not sufficient, because the idea of integration levels doesn't stop at the level of the individual. Because I could say, for example, well, you're married, so now you're a part of that. That's another superordinate structure. It's a real structure. It's not a structure that's embodied in a single body, but it's a structure that's embodied in two very closely interacting bodies. So that makes it's a meta body, but then that's integrated in a family, and that's integrated in a community, and then a town, and then a state, and then a nation. And even the level of the nation isn't necessarily the highest level of integration. And to identify the individual as arbitrarily as the pinnacle of the integration process is an error, I think. And that addresses the problem of self-regulation. So you're not integrated properly when your wife hates you. Right, so a huge source of information that we use to determine whether we've integrated our internal states properly isn't whether they're functioning for us as individuals, it's whether they allow us to integrate ourselves harmoniously into a marriage, into a family, into a community, into a town. And then the measure of integration becomes not the existence of the individual, but the existence of harmony across every single one of those levels simultaneously. And so that harmony is what we're striving for. I think that harmony is exemplified by music, by the way.
How so?
Well, music does the same thing. Music takes diverse elements and it organizes them into higher and higher order integrated hierarchies. And you can see people acting this out when they dance, like to an orchestra. You have all the diverse players who are doing the same thing. They're integrated. And then you see people moving themselves in couples and then in a community in relationship to the music. It's a model for this. It's a heavenly hierarchy. That's the way you express it in terms of ideas that are derived, let's say, from the history of religion. And so I think we've made a big mistake as psychologists assuming it's because we're basically liberal Protestants in our orientation. We assume that the individual is the pinnacle of the integration process, but it's not accurate.
I would say there's other reasons why we might concentrate on the individual.
There are other reasons.
It's because that's bound off. It's got borders around it. It lives and dies. So this 3-pound brain will at some point go away, but the other brains in the community will stick around. That sort of thing. So it's a natural enough place. But
there's every reason to assume that it exists.
Right.
It's whether it exists as the pinnacle. That's the other question.
Okay, fair enough. But what it's trying to do within its 3-pound universe is figure out all these tasks. Okay, how do I work within a community? How do I work within my larger nation state and so on? But I think we can corner it to that 3-pound organ and then talk about what are the neural networks in here that are battling it out.
Okay, but what? Okay, that's possible, but I'm not thoroughly convinced of it because I think it's reasonable. Like, why not assume that the neural network that's made out of a communicating group is like it is
part of the larger neural network,
and it's certainly moving information back and forth, and it has an existence. Like, it's not as obvious to our perceptions as the embodied form of an individual, right? And so it's more abstracted in that sense. But I don't see that it's of a lower order of reality.
I totally agree with you. It is a network inside larger networks.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely right. But as a neuroscientist, that's the level that I choose, especially as a sociologist. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So within that, you've got these different networks. One of the things, and you and I have talked about this previously, but this question about, okay, so as Friedrich Nietzsche said, each drive philosophizes in its own spirit. Meaning, when I'm hungry, when I'm angry, when I'm happy,
when I'm addicted,
these things don't just drive me, but they actually have their whole story. They tell me, oh, this is true, this is the right. And Nietzsche had what did he call this? Perspectivism, I think, which is this idea that this is why it's hard to say what a single truth is, because you've got all these different drives, which we might call personalities, whatever, but you've got these different things that tell you different truths.
Well, they also have different criteria for truth.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And this is something that pragmatists under William James were wrestling with at the end of the 1800s. So the pragmatists who saw analogies very directly between their philosophical work and Darwinian theories really derived a new theory of truth. And the new theory of truth was something like truth good enough. Like, something is true if it's good enough as a tool to obtain a certain end, right? And it's an interesting definition because it takes into account the fact that none of our truths are ultimate, right? All our truths are proximate. And then you might say, because we're ignorant, right? We're bounded by our ignorance. Nothing we know is absolute. So then you say, well, how do you know that something's true? And the answer is something like, it functions in relationship to its intended purpose, in relationship to a goal. Now, that lays open the question of what are true goals, but that's okay for now. And when a drive philosophizes, it's looking for the truths that enable it to attain its end.
Yes.
Right. And that's its criteria for truth.
Yes.
Right. This is a good enough argument to win the battle with my wife.
Right.
Right. It's true enough. For what? So I can dominate her, let's say. Yeah, right.
Yes, exactly. And so the thing that you and I have discussed before is the possibility that instead of each of these drives actually owning its own personality, it might be sort of reaching out to other places and saying, you know, when I think about what I want to get out of the prefrontal cortex, or, you know, what I want to get in terms of words to use in this argument or something, it's drawing on these other mechanisms, these subsystems that are there. But here's the thing. The question is about the conflict in these things and the way that these things battle with each other. So how do you think about the way these battle and the way, as we mature, we are working these battles out? We're working out how to get these things.
Well, I think that is the job of the cortex. But the cortex is highly socialized, right? So you can think about it neurologically, it's the job of the cortex, but then the cortex is programmed by these larger networks, right? Definitely. Okay, so what happens to you if you're well socialized is that these underlying motivational systems arrange themselves in a game so that each of them gets what they want at often enough in a manner that doesn't interfere with the future or makes the future better even, and in a manner that allows for the benefits of social community, right? So this is a very tight set of constraints, and I think the developmental psychologist Piaget probably modeled this better than anyone else I know of. And he put it in terms of, it's not game theory exactly, because game theory is a technical endeavor of its own, but Piaget spent an awful lot of time analyzing the structure of games as the prototype of both maturity and of socialization. And a game, for Piaget, a game is a voluntarily shared aim with agreed upon procedures. The voluntary part being very, very important. And I would say, if you're trying to integrate rage and lust, let's say, you can use pain as a suppressive, or fear as a suppressive mechanism, even neurologically. Like, as a parent, you could punish your child viciously every time they were aggressive. And that aggression would come under the inhibitory control of fear, and you could call that socialization. But a much more effective way to do that is to entice and invite the child to integrate that integration into something like higher order competition towards a distal goal. And that's what you do, for example, if you trained a competitive child, so an aggressive child, to be an athletic victor. So the aggression is now directed towards a social aim, right? And that would be the game. And the aggression actually becomes something that's good rather than bad, because if you have a sports team, you want your players to want to win. You want them to be competitive. But then if they're well socialized, it's like aggression within rules towards an aim. And the aim would be the victory of the game, but not just that, the well-being of the team, the growth of the team across time, the ability of the team to get along with other teams, and the generalization of that to a broader range of games. That's what it would be to be a good sport, for example. So that's a game-like model of motivational integration towards a higher order ethos, right? Future-oriented and community-oriented.
Right, exactly. So we learn as we grow from a child who has these different drives. Yeah. We're learning how to make these cooperate for communal reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the future.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that interests me the most is how these things stay rivaling our whole lives, and how we work out strategies for this. So one thing you and I have talked about before is the Ulysses contract, where you say, I know I want to do this kind of thing in the future, and so I'm going to I'm going to make some unbreakable pact where I can't break it, and I have to do this thing in the future. But I'm also interested, I want to talk to you about story and religion, and how those can be ways that steer us when we are thinking about these internal conflicts.
Well, I was interested in your Ulysses contract model, but the model that sprung to mind for me when you walked through that was the Old Testament model of covenant. Because covenant is actually contract.
So unpack that.
Well, the relationship with the divine in the Old Testament is characterized as a covenant. That's a contract. Okay, it's a sacrificial contract, which is a very specific kind of contract. And I think the sacrificial contract is the basis of maturity and community. I think it is by definition. Well,
and what does sacrificial mean? Like,
means I give up something now to get something later.
Got it. Oh, okay.
That's the sacrifice.
Yes.
There's no difference between that and work, right? Because when I work, I sacrifice the present to the future.
Yeah.
Right. That work is sacrificial. Okay, now, this is a matter of definition. Once you know that, a very interesting question enters the stage, you might say, which is, what's the most effective form of sacrifice, right? And the biblical stories examine that from every conceivable angle. So, for example, one of the very early stories in the biblical corpus is the story of Cain and Abel. And it's a story of two patterns of sacrifice, one of which succeeds, at least in the divine sense, and the other which fails cataclysmically. And that's the sacrifice, the false sacrifice of Cain. It sets up a pattern of sacrifice. One is immature, prideful, usurping, and self-serving. And it degenerates into murder and genocide, right? And then the flood comes. That's how those stories are arranged. The other is the sacrifice of Abel. And Abel's sacrifices are those that are pleasing to God. Well, that opens the next question, which is exactly as we pointed out earlier. Once you know that the foundation of community and the future is sacrifice, the only question that remains is, what's the appropriate sacrifice? And this is a very complex question. There's other ordering possibilities, like the postmodernist notion, essentially, is that power is the uniting meta-narrative.
What's an example of that?
Well, the Marxist presupposition that society is a as a zero-sum competition between the oppressor and the oppressed on the economic plane. That's been generalized by the neo-Marxists, let's say, to be what, a multi-dimensional battle of power. And you know, you can see some truth in that when you think about, for example, if you were thinking about the solution to the problem of rivalry only as competition, as unbridled competition. But as soon as you understand that there's bridled forms of competition, maybe that's why you're interested in the Ulysses contract, because that puts structure around rivalry.
Yeah,
right.
That's
How
right.
do you structure rivalry? So maybe that's why it captured your attention so intensely.
Right.
Because that's a crucial question, right? How do you delimit the demands of power, let's say? That's another way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm interested, I mean, what's your take on the role of story in saying, so I've always got all these possible paths that I could take, and I'm always facing temptation. Everyone is, and the question is, you know, does story in general, biblical stories or otherwise, give us a sense of, oh, here's a model that I hadn't thought of before, and I can look up to this character, and I can navigate, or down, that's right, and navigate myself accordingly.
Well, okay, so a story is a description of a hierarchy of value. It's an embodied hierarchy of value. Okay, so when God assigns a role to Adam, he says, your role is to name, identify, and subdue. And subdue means to put everything in its proper place. Okay, so someone's character is the manner in which they put things into place, right? They're a priority. When you go watch a movie, what you see is the embodiment of a structure of prioritization. This person has an aim, they have a strategy, they have some things for them come first. That's the things they attend to. That's what you're watching when you watch the character. You reflect the perceptions and the emotions, and you observe the success of the strategy, right? So what a story presents to you is a hierarchy of attentional and action priority, and it's extremely valuable, and then you can test them out. And I say that's the technical definition of a story. And so we're always looking for a better story, and the story would be the structure that integrates the conflicts. That's another way of thinking about it.
That's really lovely, right? Because I always think about story as, what always has grabbed me is the way that we slip so easily into characters, into story. In other words, neuroscientists, we study the brain, we say, oh, look, here's how the visual system works. You have photons hit the retina, you figure out what you're looking at, what you're hearing, and so on. But in fact, what brains do most of the time is they don't care at all about what's in front of them. They're thinking about other things. They're simulating possible futures, they're reminiscing about the past, or they're slipping into literature, and they become the character. So I love what you said about the reason you become the character is you get to experience the world from a different attentional vantage.
Definitely. Exactly.
That's very cool.
It's a different structure. Well, look. So a typical story element, let's say in an romantic action adventure movie is, do you save the woman you love or do you serve your country? Right. So you can see both of those are very well-developed hierarchies of value. There's real reasons to prioritize the person you love, and there's real reasons to prioritize your nation. Okay, so now what do you do when those are head-to-head? Well, the character of the protagonist determines the answer to that question. Right. And
so you get to live in those shoes and see what he does and see how that resonates with you.
Yeah, and you can see whether that's an uphill journey or a downhill journey.
Yes.
Right, and so, or a variant of that, and this is the most standard variant, is the comedic variant, which is obstacle, crisis, resolution, but resolution at a higher order, right? That's the divine comedy. Tragedy is just the descent, right? That's the emergence of entropy. That's a way of thinking about it. Entropy would be, well, your belief system collapses because it encounters an obstacle that's insurmountable. Now you're bereft, and that's the end of you, right? That's tragic dissolution of the would-be hero.
That's right. And just so everyone's following, entropy is this idea of, instead of having a clear path, you've got multiple possibilities. That's this idea of an increase of entropy. Your brain is anxious and it doesn't know where to go.
So what happens when things fall apart? Or which you don't know which way is up, or when you don't know where you're going, or when you're lost in the desert. Right. Or you're in despair, right? All of those are high entropy states.
Exactly. And what the brain is always trying to do is save energy. That's essentially its main function.
does.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Oh, that's...
Yeah. That was Schrodinger's definition of life, essentially. It's an anti-entropic function, right? So the association of anxiety with entropy is very, very fundamental, Stories are ways of constraining entropy. That's right. That isn't all they do, because they provide an aim and they provide hope, but even that's an entropy constraining function to some degree.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, it's really a key realization. As soon as you understand that a story describes a hierarchy of attentional prioritization, you think, oh, well, of course, because that means that the story is literally how we make sense of the world. It's a description of a structure of making sense in the world. Navigation, it's a navigational structure.
Right. And what all these lessons are, as we plow through novels, what these lessons give us is ways to manage the own conflict within our heads, with all these different drives going on.
And to do that in relationship to other people in the future.
That's exactly right. And ourselves in the future, right?
And ourselves, of course.
Right.
Of course, because we're actually a community across time. Right? So that's partly why there's an analogy between the self and the community. It's like, well, why should you take care of the old? Well, you're going to be old. So if your society doesn't take care of the old, that's you, buddy. Why should you take care of the sick? Well, you may be naive and think you're going to be healthy your whole life, but you're not. So over the course of your life, you're going to, well, you could say you're going to inhabit the entire sociological cosmos. So you see reflections of this, for example. This is a very canonical example of this, in the insistence that the Savior is born in the lowly place. You see that with Moses, and you see it with Christ. Christ is born with the animals, among the animals, in a stable. Why? Well, because at some point in his life, even the greatest hero occupies the lowest position. And so then, if that's the case, then you want to set things up psychologically and socially, so even those who occupy the most lowly of positions are protected as if they're of infinite value. That's the ethos.
Oh, I see. That makes it very appealing to the whole demographic to watch the story, because if the hero is someone who already is born in privilege and rich and so on, maybe you lose a lot of the audience that way, as in, of course, the audience doesn't have the opportunity to map themselves onto the
It also means that the story that's being told doesn't span the entire range of possibility. It's like, well, here's a hero story if you're rich. Well, fair enough, and it's not like that isn't a guide, but a better guide is, here's a story that guides you when you're coming up from the abyss or from the depths or from the lowest possible place. Because the total story would take you from the lowest possible place to the highest possible place.
Right. I've always thought about that just as the size of the delta being the important thing. But your point is that opens it up to, everybody getting to see that where that spans.
It's universal. It universalizes it. Right.
That's a really good point.
And you can imagine that as a solution increases in quality, it becomes more generalizable, right? That's almost by definition. That's a good indication of its utility. This applies to everyone. So then the question is, partly, of course this is the case if you think it through. It's like, what story are human beings attempting to work out across the generations? Well, the story that applies to everyone. Well, obviously. Well, like, what else? What other story could they possibly be trying to work out? Right. The story that applies to the privileged few? Well, that would work if the privileged few were stable. But they're not, right? I mean, look, 1% of the population almost always controls 50% of the wealth. But the people who occupy that 1% aren't the same people, even within the span of their life. So, like, the water that's running from a faucet makes a stable column, but the molecules are different from second to second. Well, it's the same with these distributions in social status. And so, a rich person who goes to school is still the youngest kid in the school, is still going to be subject to bullying, is still going to be low on the social totem pole. And so you need an ethos that applies to everyone across all possible social positions. Right. And a universal, that's why Harry Potter's an orphan. Right? Because he's lost, he's parentless, he occupies he lives under the stairs with like tyrannical parents. Right, but it doesn't matter because he's the hero that redeems everything. Right. So that's a universalizing story. And that's why it's sold like, hundreds of millions of copies.
Yeah, quite right. So when we think about, okay, so coming back to the issue of rivalry between, I think about them as networks, you think about them as personalities, other people think about them as drives, and certainly some of the things are drives. Some of the hypothalamic issues are, thirst, fear, hunger, sex.
Well, the more automated they are, the more they're drive-like.
Yeah, that's
right. So and the more phylogenetically ancient they are, because they can just run as programs.
That's a really good point, actually. So we shouldn't call them all drives or all personalities. I totally agree with what you're saying. These really automated hypothalamic things, those are really like drives.
You can think about them as personalities with very few degrees of freedom.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, so like sexual behavior, once it's instigated, collapses into a relatively, there's few degrees of freedom.
That's right.
But so it's more drive-like.
But it still has a personality in terms of the things it notices, the things it says to try to seduce and so on. Yeah, that's right.
Right. Okay, so then we can think the more phylogenetically ancient the motivational state, the more drive-like it becomes.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's mostly automated.
Good, excellent. So personality is on a spectrum here. Okay.
Yeah. So or complexity of personality is at least.
That's right. So how do you think about maturation and all these personalities that you have? What's your take on what it means to mature in the world?
Okay. Here's a way of thinking. I think this is very cool. So imagine that you have a drive to admire. Okay, because you do.
Okay.
What do
you mean, like other people? Or
sure, just the fact that exists. It's like you'll admire someone. It's like, I would say the drive to admire is the manifestation of the instinct to mature.
Okay, let me understand that. Can you unpack?
Yep. Okay, well, so look, a 4-year-old is going to admire a 6-year-old, all things considered. They'll usually pick someone that's in their zone of proximal development, right? So someone they could be.
Yeah.
Right, and so now this instinct that compels them to admire, right, to copy and to attend to, picks a potential future self that's obtainable and then grips them. Okay, that's the instinct to mature. Yeah. Right, so then you could say we've got all these hypothalamic functions that are subpersonalities, but there's a meta function as well that's also biologically instantiated that drives us towards maturation and integration and integrates all those subpersonalities. And that manifests itself in the experience of admiration. And then we admire heroes in books and we admire religious figures. And those are all, here's how you make a religious figure. It's simple. You take 10 admirable people, and they're the same because they're admirable, so they exist in a category. You extract out everything that's admirable, you sink it into a single personality, and you posit that as an ideal. And you do that 1,000 times, you have a savior. A savior will emerge out of that.
Yeah. Oh, terrific, terrific.
Right.
Okay, and then and so to summarize this, what we then do is we use that savior as a way, when we have an internal battle, we say, it gives us some, I don't know.
We say, what would Jesus do?
Exactly, what would deity X do here?
Yeah, that's right.
Because so both literature and let's say religion, even at a higher level of this, gives us a way to deal with this conflict. Because as you and I have talked about before, what we're always trying to do is reduce entropy and not have every possibility open. And often we know that there's a conflict between instant gratification and long-term thinking, who we want to be. And so that gives us a way to grip onto it, to say, what would this deity do?
Well, and the fact that example is exemplified in a story also makes it generalizable. And here's why. So if you watch children play house, let's say a little boy is playing the father, you might say, well, he's imitating his father, but that's not right. What he does is he watches his father, and then he watches instantiations of the father in, say, movies, Disney movies and the books he's reading, and he abstracts out the character of the father. Now, the character of the father is a far more generalizable understanding than pure imitation. It's less drive-like. It's more personality-like. So if you have a savior instantiated in a story, you can generalize from the story to the novel situation, which you couldn't do if you were just imitating.
Yes, good call.
Right. So that's how you encapsulate the spirit of the story. The spirit's the pattern that can be generalized.
Yeah. What's interesting is this is not, to my knowledge, this is not really studied in neuroscience. So we don't know, where do you store the savior? I mean, presumably this is all prefrontal, long-term thinking stuff. Somehow that shapes your circuits. The fact that I know of a savior
we study it in some ways. But we don't know we're studying it.
Okay.
If you study vervet monkeys, for example, vervet monkeys will look longer at photographs of high status vervet monkeys than of low status in their tribe, right?
Yeah,
in their group. Right. So there's an association between social status and movement towards that admirable figure. And the alpha chimp is the highest status chimp. Okay, so you might say, well, he's the most powerful chimp. He's the most brutal chimp. It's like Franz de Waal blew that theory to bits. That isn't the case. Stable alphas are reciprocal and they have very dense friendship networks. Right, so now you could say, you take alpha, you're a chimp, you take alpha 1 in one generation and alpha 2 in the second generation and 3 and 4 and 5, and then you amalgamate them. Well, that's, Eliade had tracked that development in religious stories. That's exactly what happens, is that's how memory actually works. Is imagine there's a historical figure who's memorable and stories are told about him, but then it's 3 generations later and everyone who knew him died. Well, all the stories get amalgamated into a central hero figure, and that's what's remembered.
Right.
That's what's remembered.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what stories are told about.
That's what's remembered, and that is what is taught. And when it's taught to somebody, then they can use that hero figure as a way to navigate.
Or they even act it out. They dramatize it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
That's right. That's exactly right. So the historical memory aggregates into singular figures.
Right.
And then those are elevated.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And my point is, I think we don't understand entirely how that we know about mirror neurons and the fact that we impersonate others, but this is a big part of why we have hero stories in religion and so on, is so that we can say, oh, that's somebody worth mirroring. That's
definitely.
That's
and
right.
admiration is the key to that.
Yes.
And that's it, where you can say the instinctual basis of it. And that admiration is probably the drive as well that compels a child to listen to his father if he admires him, right? And you'd need that, because otherwise, why would the child make the father a figure of attentional prioritization? There has to be an instinct there, which is an instinct to respond, let's say, to the paternal. And then if the father matches the paternal template genetically, then he's going to catalyze that instinct for admiration, and learning is going to take place.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Hey, my pleasure,
I
man.
loved this conversation. There were so many things that came out.
Yeah.
Great.
It was my pleasure.
That was my conversation with Jordan Peterson, and I just want to summarize a few of the parts that I found particularly important. First, nobody you know is one thing, like a computer system with a single operating system, but instead, each person you look at can be somewhat different under different circumstances. And the part that sometimes is harder to see is that this applies equally to ourselves. We are each built of different networks with different goals, and your behavior falls under the grip of different drives, like when you're trying to obtain something, or you're hungry, or you're sexually driven, or you're angry, or you're calm and thinking about your long-term goals. Whatever state you're in modifies not just how you act and what you decide, but what you even notice and how you perceive it. I'll give you an example. One study showed that when people are thirsty, they're more likely to perceive an ambiguous surface as transparent, like water. This is like a parched traveler seeing mirages of water in a desert. Versions of this sort of thing happen all the time. What we see and what we notice depends on our drives. A person with an addiction to drugs, sex, food, anything else will notice threats and opportunities differently than someone else. They notice what they need to notice to obtain what they seek. But because we're always trapped inside ourselves, it can be difficult to see that we're different people at different times. This only becomes clear in those moments when we look back and we think, wow, I really can't believe I did that, or said that, or thought that was a good idea. A century ago, Albert Einstein commented on how when a scientist looks at raw data, they can only see what their frameworks allow them to see. He said, quote, "It is the theory which decides what can be observed." In other words, there's raw data out there, but if you don't have a framework for something, you won't even see it. And the heart of today's episode is the same sort of idea, not about a theory, but a personality. The personality, the drive that grips you at the moment, the neural network that is winning for the moment, that decides what can be observed. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that I'm obsessed with the differences between people in terms of what they perceive from the world. But today's episode is fundamentally about the differences between you and you at different moments in time. Sometimes the role of religion or literature is to set up ideals that we admire. And that way, instead of just looking to other people, we can look to an envisioned future self. We can say, okay, I have a vision that I kind of like for the sort of person that I want to be. Even if you don't feel like that person now, you can build a model of that future you, an ideal self that satisfies the greatest number of constraints, both individual and communal, and then you can navigate your decisions in deference to that. So as we wrap up, here's the takeaway. You are not one singular, unchanging entity, but instead a shifting constellation of drives, states, neural networks, each vying for control in different moments. And recognizing this fluidity can be a powerful tool, not only for understanding your past actions and moments of regret, but also for shaping your future self. By consciously constructing ideal versions of yourself, whether through thinking about it or writing on religious or literary exemplars, we can use these to help guide our choices. Because if we are at our core a team of rivals, then the challenge and the opportunity is learning how to captain that argumentative team toward the optimal outcomes. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion. And check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.